The email arrived like a stray bullet, piercing the quiet sanctity of Raj's office. He had been meticulously cross-referencing ancient Sumerian texts, the scent of aged paper and dust a comforting presence. The subject line, terse and unexpected, read, "Estate of family name redacted. Inheritance notification." Raj, a man whose life revolved around the precise geometry of logic and documented fact, frowned. His family, a nebulous concept he rarely entertained, had long since faded into a distant hum of unremembered faces and forgotten names. He opened the message. It was from an estate lawyer, a terse block of legalese informing him of his sole inheritance. A sprawling, ancient family estate nestled deep in a secluded valley, hundreds of miles from his current life. Raj felt no surge of excitement, only a mild irritation at the disruption. A property, particularly an old one, meant complications, liabilities, an unwelcome intrusion of the physical world into his intellectual one. Still, the pragmatic part of his mind, the part that valued order and responsibility, knew he had to address it. He booked a train ticket, then a rental car, his movements as precise and deliberate as the footnotes in his academic papers. The journey itself was a slow unraveling of civilization. The paved roads gave way to cracked asphalt, then to gravel, and finally to a narrow, rutted track that snaked through increasingly dense forest. The air grew heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves. The chirping of birds, once a constant companion, receded, replaced by an oppressive quiet punctuated only by the groan of the rental car's suspension. Raj watched the odometer tick over, each mile taking him further from the world he understood, deeper into a landscape that felt ancient and untamed. He found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, a subtle tension coiling in his shoulders. He passed through a small, forgotten village, a cluster of weathered stone cottages huddled together as if for warmth against the encroaching wilderness. A lone figure, an old woman with a face like crumpled parchment, paused her sweeping to watch his car pass. His gaze, Raj noted, was not merely curious, but held a strange, almost pitying intensity. He saw her lips move, perhaps a silent blessing or a warning, but the words were lost to the rumble of the engine. He dismissed it as quaint local superstition, a vestige of a time before reason. Just beyond the village, the valley opened up, not with a welcoming expanse, but with a sudden, suffocating breadth. The sky above seemed lower, heavier, and there, against the backdrop of an imposing, mist-shrouded peak, stood the estate. It wasn't merely a house. It was a behemoth, a dark, sprawling mass of crumbling stone and decaying timber, half swallowed by centuries of ivy and neglect. From this distance, high on a ridge, Raj could also discern, clinging precariously to the craggy slopes of a distant, more remote peak, the stoic gray outline of a remote monastery, a stark, silent counterpoint to the decaying grandeur below. He wondered what tales those ancient walls could tell, what they had witnessed over the centuries. The drive down to the estate was a winding descent, the track choked with weeds and fallen branches. He drove through, the tires crunching on gravel that hadn't seen traffic in decades. He parked the car in front of the main entrance, a massive oak door studded with iron, swollen and warped by time. The air here was different, heavier, laden with the scent of wet stone, mildew, and something else. Something metallic and faint, like old rust mixed with stagnant water. Raj stepped out, the gravel crunching under his sensible shoes, the sound shockingly loud in the profound stillness. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, just the distant, mournful sigh of the wind through the ancient trees that ringed the property. He looked up at the house. He immediately rationalized it. The isolation, the sheer scale of the neglect, the accumulated dust of generations. Yet, a part of him, a small, unacknowledged corner of his meticulous mind, felt a prickle of unease. It wasn't merely old, it felt aware. He could almost feel the weight of its history pressing down on him, a silent, unseen force. This was not just a property. It was a presence. Raj, ever the academic, took a deep breath, pushing down the nascent unease. He had a project on his hands, a formidable one. He would approach it with the same rigorous logic he applied to his Sumerian texts. He would restore it, catalog it, understand it. He was a man of reason, and reason, he knew, always prevailed. The journey to the remote monastery had been a descent into forgotten time. The paved road surrendered to gravel, then to a rutted track barely wide enough for the borrowed utility vehicle. The final miles a tortuous crawl through an increasingly dense and ancient forest. Trees, gnarled and thick with moss, pressed in on either side, their branches weaving a canopy that choked out the sun. When the tree line finally broke, the remote monastery emerged, not as a sudden revelation, but as a gradual, imposing presence. Its sprawling form seemed less built and more grown from the very earth, a mosaic of dark gray rock and crumbling mortar. Broken windows stared like vacant eyes, and the roof, a patchwork of slate and exposed timber, sagged in places. His initial days were a blur of practicalities. Raj, clad in work clothes, moved through the cavernous rooms, a clipboard in hand, making lists, assessing damage, planning the monumental task of restoration. He hired a local contractor, a stoic, weathered man who introduced himself only as the builder, and a young, eager assistant who mostly observed. Raj supervised, his meticulous nature finding a strange satisfaction in the methodical catalog of decay. He began in what appeared to be the main study, a vast room with tall, arched windows overlooking the overgrown grounds. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the gloom, illuminating peeling wallpaper and heavy carved wooden panels. The first anomalies were subtle, easily rationalized. A persistent, faint scratching sound, like claws on wood, emanating from the walls near the grand fireplace. Raj attributed it to rodents, a common problem in old structures, making a note to call an exterminator. Then, a heavy brass paperweight, which he distinctly remembered placing on a stack of architectural plans, appeared on the floor a few feet away, nestled against the leg of a forgotten armchair. He frowned, blaming his own absent-mindedness or perhaps the vibrations from the builder's heavy footsteps upstairs. Later, while attempting to pry open a stubbornly jammed window in a disused chapel, he heard what sounded like a sigh, soft and long, directly behind him. He spun around, expecting to see the builder or his assistant, but the chapel was empty. The sound, he decided, must have been the wind, funneling through a crack in the ancient stone or whistling through a loose pane of glass. The draft that followed, however, was icy, raising gooseflesh on his arms despite the mild afternoon. He tugged his collar higher, attributing it to the monastery's poor insulation. He remained focused on the tangible, the crumbling plaster, the dry rot in the floorboards, the leaking roof. He needed to be systematic. One afternoon, while examining the ornate mantelpiece in the study, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings of entwined vines and grotesque faces, he noticed something peculiar. One of the wooden panels, a section depicting a hooded figure amidst the foliage, felt slightly loose. He pressed it, and it gave way with a faint click, sinking inward by a fraction of an inch. A hidden compartment. A thrill, not of fear, but of academic curiosity, surged through him. He retrieved a small pry bar from his toolkit and carefully worked the panel free. Behind it, not a cavity in the stone, but a shallow, meticulously crafted recess. The air that wafted out was still, heavy with the scent of dried herbs and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like old blood and dust. Its surface was smooth, almost polished, despite its obvious age, and adorned with unfamiliar symbols carved into its lid, interlocking spirals and angular lines that seemed to writhe beneath his fingertips. It was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so. Beside it, a single yellowed parchment, tightly rolled and tied with a brittle black thread. Raj's breath hitched. This was not a misplaced tool or a gust of wind. This was a deliberate concealment. He carefully lifted the wooden box. It possessed an unexpected weight, solid and dense, far heavier than its size suggested. The parchment, when unrolled, revealed faded script in a language he didn't immediately recognize, though its angular characters hinted at an archaic form of the local dialect, peppered with symbols that were utterly alien. He wasn't a man given to flights of fancy, but the meticulous craftsmanship of the compartment, the deliberate secrecy, and the unsettling contents defied easy explanation. Rodents didn't carve intricate boxes or write cryptic texts. He ran his thumb over the carved symbols on the box, a strange heat radiating from them, a faint pulse that seemed to match the beat of his own heart. The rational part of his mind, the academic, sought to classify, to analyze. An old family heirloom, perhaps, a relic of some forgotten local cult or superstition. The seed of doubt, carefully planted, began to sprout. The unveiling of history. The air in the study, already thick with the scent of aged paper and dormant dust, seemed to press in on Raj. His fingers, still slightly numb from the unexpected effort of unlatching the hidden panel, traced the rough-hewn edges of the small, deep recess. Inside, nestled amongst dried, crumbling leaves he couldn't immediately identify, lay not a single cryptic note, but a collection of slender, leather-bound journals. They were old, their covers cracked and faded, the pages within yellowed and brittle. He extracted the first one, its weight surprisingly dense, and placed it carefully on the mahogany desk. Rodents did not carve intricate compartments. A disquieting hum, subtle as a whispered secret, seemed to emanate from the silence of the room. He told himself it was the old house settling, the wind outside, anything but what his instinct clawed at him to consider. With a deep, cleansing breath, Raj opened the topmost journal. The faint, sweet smell of decay and something indefinably metallic wafted up. The handwriting, elegant yet spidery, filled the first page. It was a woman's hand, dated over a century ago. He began to read, his academic curiosity, for a fleeting moment, eclipsing the burgeoning unease. The initial entries were innocuous enough. Chronicles of daily life, seasonal changes, local gossip, the mundane rhythms of a bygone era. But as he turned the fragile pages, a subtle shift occurred. The tone darkened. A recurring theme emerged, a peculiar affliction, not of the body, not a physical entity, but a pervasive presence. It feeds on fear. An ancestor, a man named Alistair, had scrawled in a later journal, his hand visibly less steady than the woman's. It grows with each troubled breath, each sleepless night. The old house groaned, a long, drawn-out sound that seemed to reverberate in his bones. But the sound seemed to linger, a deep sigh from the very structure around him. He found entries detailing desperate attempts to ward off the encroaching malaise. Peculiar arrangements of dried herbs, symbols etched into doorframes, even a cryptic reference to a series of offerings made in the hidden cellar. The rationality he prided himself on began to fray at the edges. He glanced towards the closed door, convinced for a moment that he'd heard a faint dragging sound from the hallway. Nothing. He had sought not medical aid, but spiritual counsel, believing the family was plagued by an ancient malevolent force. Her entries were filled with descriptions of the monastery's stern, silent residents, their deep-set eyes, and their grim warnings about forces that could latch onto bloodlines, growing stronger with each passing generation. Ilara wrote of their ancient texts, their protective rituals, and their despairing admission that some evils, once rooted, could only be contained, never truly expunged. The entry ended abruptly, describing her return to the estate with a sense of fatalistic resignation. A fine layer of dust, disturbed by an unseen tremor, drifted down from the ceiling. His gaze snapped to the window, where the heavy velvet curtains, previously still, now swayed with a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if pushed by a breath that was not wind. He swallowed, his throat dry. The sheer consistency of the accounts, spanning generations, detailing the same insidious presence, the same illnesses of the spirit, was too much to dismiss as mere coincidence or shared delusion. The house no longer felt like a mere collection of bricks and timber. It felt like a participant, a witness, perhaps even an accomplice to the unfolding horror contained within the brittle pages. The house's groan had not been a simple creak of settling timbers. Raj knew it, deep in the marrow of his bones, even as he tried to dismiss the thought. It had been a drawn-out lament, a sound that seemed to resonate with a profound, ancient weariness, or perhaps a simmering hunger. But the thought felt thin, a flimsy shield against an encroaching chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. Sleep, when it finally came, offered no respite. He would dream of the house, but not as he knew it. Its walls would pulse, a slow, viscous beat, like an enormous hidden heart. He never reached it. He always woke, gasping, sweat-soaked, the phantom scent of damp earth and something acrid clinging to his nostrils. The days blurred into a cycle of bone-deep fatigue and escalating paranoia. The house, it seemed, actively resented his presence, or perhaps his efforts to tame it. He decided to tackle the ancient electrical system in the old library, a room he hoped to transform into his study. He laid out his tools meticulously: wire strippers, pliers, a multimeter. He climbed the rickety ladder, the wood groaning under his weight, and began to carefully strip a section of frayed wiring near the ceiling. He turned for a moment to grab a new connector, and when he looked back, the wire strippers were gone from the top of the ladder. He searched the floor, the surrounding shelves, his own pockets. Nothing. He distinctly remembered placing them there. He eventually found them, hours later, tucked neatly inside an antique book on a shelf across the room, a book he hadn't touched. It was unnerving, a childish prank perhaps, but there was no one else in the house. The new copper gleamed, a small victory. He tested the faucet, and a trickle of rust-colored water emerged, followed by a steady, clear stream. Satisfied, he left it. The next morning, a putrid, stagnant odor assaulted him as he passed the washroom door. Inside, the new copper pipe was corroded, covered in a greenish-black mildew, and the sink was overflowing with a thick, viscous liquid that smelled faintly of decay. He stared at it, his mind reeling. He had installed it flawlessly. He was meticulous. This wasn't possible. These incidents, small at first, accumulated, chipping away at his logical defenses. The isolation became a physical burden. The thought of explaining the vanishing tools or the spontaneously corroded pipes, of voicing his growing conviction that the house was alive, was simply too absurd. They would think him mad. His gaze fell upon a particularly gnarled section of the wall near the hidden staircase, an area he hadn't paid much attention to before, thinking it was just aged plasterwork. But in the lamp's wavering glow, he saw it. A carving, faint and almost indistinguishable from the peeling paint and grime, yet undeniably present. It was a symbol he recognized, a twisted knot of lines and circles, eerily similar to one he had glimpsed in the margins of the most disturbing journal entries, those detailing the offerings and the deep hunger. But this wasn't merely a static image. As he leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat, the lines of the carving seemed to subtly undulate, to shift with a faint, almost imperceptible pulse, as if drawn in something living. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the sensation persisted, a low, throbbing energy emanating from the ancient plaster. Desperate, Raj decided he needed answers, or at least a different perspective. He remembered the cryptic references in some local historical texts to a remote monastery nestled high in the valley's furthest reaches, a place said to preserve ancient knowledge and traditions. He arrived at the remote monastery as dusk bled across the sky. A squat stone edifice clinging to the mountainside like a barnacle. A lone, elderly monk, his face a road map of deep wrinkles, met him at the heavy oak door. Some roots run too deep, Raj. Some legacies are not meant to be disturbed. They merely sleep, waiting for a key. He spoke of ancient currents and the pull of the unseen, offering no practical advice. Only veiled warnings that felt more like pronouncements of doom. You seek to mend what was never broken, only bound, the elder continued. A profound sadness etched into his features. And what is bound seeks to be free. The cost of such freedom. It is always paid in blood or insanity. Raj left the remote monastery with a heavier heart than when he arrived, the monk's words echoing in his ears. Not as a comfort, but as a confirmation of his deepest fears. He was sleep-deprived, his nerves frayed, the lines between reality and nightmare irrevocably blurred. He had stared into the oppressive darkness of the main hall, the echo clinging to the stagnant air, and for the first time, his academic skepticism had faltered. The journals, the strange symbols, the chilling accounts of his forebears, they were coalescing into something undeniable, something that demanded answers beyond the estate's crumbling walls. He was determined to find them. The next morning, the mist still clinging to the valley floor, Raj drove his vehicle down the winding dirt track, leaving the brooding estate behind. The nearest settlement, a cluster of weathered stone buildings clinging to a hillside, offered little solace. The few inhabitants he encountered, a grizzled shopkeeper whose eyes darted nervously, a quiet woman tending a small vegetable patch, offered only terse responses and averted gazes. That place, best left undisturbed, the shopkeeper mumbled, wiping his counter with a cloth that seemed to merely redistribute the dust. He wouldn't meet Raj's eye. Old stories, sir. Nothing for a man of your learning. A man sitting outside the small, solitary tavern, his face a road map of sun-baked wrinkles, merely grunted when Raj approached. The old ways. Some things ain't meant for books. Some things just are. He took a slow drag from his pipe, the smoke curling around his face like a veil, and pointed vaguely towards the higher peaks. There's a place up past the old logging trails. They keep the histories, the real ones. Raj understood. He was being pointed towards the remote monastery. It was a long shot, a desperate attempt to grasp at threads of information the locals clearly wished to bury. The drive was arduous, the road quickly deteriorating into little more than a rocky path. Finally, after what felt like hours, the tree line thinned, revealing a stark, ancient structure carved from the same gray rock as the mountainside. No smoke rose from its chimneys, no sound emanated from its thick walls. It felt less like a place of worship, and more like a fortress, guarding forgotten knowledge. He found an elder, a man whose face was a study in serene gravity, tending a small herb garden in a sun-dappled courtyard. The elder's robes were faded, his hands gnarled, but his eyes held an unsettling depth. Raj introduced himself, explaining his lineage, his inheritance, and his growing unease. The elder listened, his expression unchanging, a faint scent of dried herbs and old paper clinging to his garments. When Raj finished, the elder merely nodded slowly. "The blood remembers," he said, his voice a low, resonant murmur. "And the earth remembers." They descended a narrow, spiraling staircase, the stone steps worn smooth by generations of feet. Below, a vast subterranean archive stretched out, shelves groaning under the weight of countless scrolls and leather-bound tomes. "Your ancestor," the elder began, gesturing towards a specific section. "The founder of your line here, he was singular. He sought understanding where others sought only peace. He believed the valley held a secret, a power." Raj's fingers trembled as he pulled a thick, unwieldy ledger from a shelf. Its cover was stiff, the leather brittle, and the pages within were filled with cramped, spidery script, heavily annotated with arcane symbols Raj recognized from his own family's journals. This was the work of the patriarch, the one the elder had spoken of. The ancestor had not merely been obsessed with the estate, he had been devoted to it. He spoke of the house as a nexus, a mouthpiece, a place where the veil between worlds thinned. He detailed not just observations of strange occurrences, but attempts to interact with them. There were records of specific dates, lunar cycles, and rituals. Vague, horrifying instructions involving offerings and attunements. The ancestor had believed the house was alive, a sentient entity, and he had sought to communicate with it, to harness its power. He wrote of feeling its presence grow stronger with each passing generation, each contribution to its ancient hunger. This wasn't just a ghost story. It was a horrifying inheritance. His ancestor hadn't merely lived in the house. He had actively cultivated whatever malevolence resided within it, perhaps even forged the sinister connection that now bound his bloodline to its depths. The house's groan, that profound lament or simmering hunger, was not an isolated incident. It was a familiar sound, an echo of a terrible, ongoing transaction. He felt a profound sickness rise within him, a realization that the walls of his ancestral home were not just shelter, but a cage, meticulously built by his own family. The estate wasn't merely old. It was an ancient, insatiable maw, and his ancestors, it seemed, had willingly fed it. The revelation from the journals had been a brutal, visceral strike. Raj stood in the flickering lamplight, the parchment still clutched in his hand, the ink swimming before his eyes. It wasn't just a ghost story. It was a horrifying inheritance. The house. It was a cage, a vessel, a living, breathing monument to a terrible pact. A particular passage, scrawled in a shaky hand at the end of a particularly disturbing entry, had snagged his attention, a thorn in his mind. The anchorite's cell, where silence breeds devotion, and devotion, a hunger. Seek the seventh star, where the sun forgets to rise. Raj had initially dismissed it as poetic madness, another example of his ancestors' morbid romanticism. But then, a crude, almost childish sketch appeared on the following page. A floor plan, undoubtedly of the house, with a section of the old east wing circled, and a small, unlabeled rectangle appended to it. The words, "The Silent Cloister," were written beside it, followed by "A Remnant, Preserved." Raj felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. This wasn't metaphor. This was a blueprint. A remote monastery, perhaps, twisted and repurposed over generations, its sacred spaces profaned. The anchorite's cell wasn't just a room. It was a hidden chamber, a ritual space, now a cancerous growth within the very fabric of his family home. He spent the next 2 days methodically searching. He started in the east wing, the oldest, most dilapidated section, its timbers groaning like ancient bones. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows, illuminating a world forgotten. Raj ran his hands over crumbling plaster, tapped along cold stone, his fingers tracing the faint lines of disused doorways and bricked-up archways. He found himself holding his breath more often than not, straining to hear anything over the creaks and groans of the settling structure. The seventh star clue nagged at him. He tried counting windows, floorboards, even the gnarled branches of an ancient oak outside. Nothing. Then, as he was running his hand along a stretch of exposed stone in what might have once been a small chapel or a refectory, the architecture here was distinctly different, more austere, more ancient. His fingers snagged on a loose section. Not a stone, but a cleverly disguised wooden panel, painted to blend with the weathered rock. He pressed. He pushed. It gave way with a faint click. He pushed again, harder, and the panel swung inward, not on hinges, but sliding into a recess in the wall with a grating groan. He retrieved his lantern from the nearby table, its beam cutting a wavering path into the blackness. The passage was unlit, unventilated, a testament to its long concealment. The walls were rough-hewn stone, slimy with condensation in places. The passage opened into a larger space, a chamber cut deep into the bedrock beneath the house. This was it. This was the remote monastery's secret. The anchorite's cell from the journals, now a buried, forgotten crypt. The lantern beam swept across the walls, revealing them to be rough-hewn, but carved with strange, intricate symbols. They weren't the Christian iconography one might expect from a monastery. These were geometric patterns, spiraling lines, jagged angles, and unsettling half-human, half-animal figures, all etched deeply into the stone. On one wall, a large symbol dominated, a circle bisected by a jagged line with 7 smaller stars radiating from its perimeter. The 7th star. Raj's stomach clenched. It wasn't rust. The stains were old, dried, but unmistakably blood. Beside the altar, iron rings were set into the floor and walls, long rusted but still sturdy. Restraints, holding cells. These weren't instruments of worship. They were tools of sacrifice. It wasn't a voice he could discern, but a sensation, a pressure in his mind, like a thought that wasn't his own. The air in the chamber grew heavier, denser, as if the very space was exhaling. He wasn't alone. The entity, the malevolence his ancestor had cultivated, was undeniably present here, a palpable weight in the frigid air, a silent observer in this unspeakable place. Raj felt its ancient, predatory gaze on him, a hunger that had been fed for generations, now stirring, awakened by his intrusion. This chamber wasn't just a secret. It was the heart of the house's sickness, and he, Raj, was standing right in its gruesome, beating core. A chill, distinct from the house's usual pervasive damp, seeped into Raj's bones in the hidden chamber. This was not the dry, dusty cold of an abandoned attic, but the deep, mineralic cold of ancient stone, of earth that had never seen the sun. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn wall beside him, feeling the grit, the subtle undulations that spoke of hand-carved effort, not engineered precision. He understood now. The sprawling estate, he had just realized, had not merely been built on ancient ground. It had incorporated, perhaps even swallowed, an older structure. His lamp cast a wavering circle of light, dancing over shelves carved directly into the rock. Unlike the domestic clutter of the main house, these shelves held strange, unsettling objects. Small, crudely fashioned figurines, their faces contorted in silent agony, lined one ledge. Another displayed a collection of dried, brittle herbs tied with sinew, their scent long evaporated, but their purpose unsettlingly clear. He pulled the topmost folio from its resting place. It was heavier than it looked, the pages within stiff, almost petrified. As he carefully opened it, a fine dust, smelling faintly of dried blood and old incense, puffed into the air. The script inside was dense, archaic, written in a hand that seemed to fluctuate between precise strokes and frantic scrawls. His academic training, his meticulous eye for detail, was suddenly less a comfort and more a curse. Each deciphered word a fresh nail hammered into his composure. This was not a personal diary. It was a ledger, a chronicle, detailing a history far older and more sinister than he had imagined. The early entries described rituals of appeasement, offerings of quietude and harmony, terms he initially found baffling. Then the language shifted. The quietude became silencing the discord, the harmony, the soothing of the restless. He understood with a sickening lurch that these were not spiritual metaphors. These were instructions for controlling the family members, for quelling dissent, for ensuring a pervasive, suffocating peace that fed something. He turned a page, his fingers trembling slightly. Here, the entries grew more explicit, the hand more agitated. The family would be granted prosperity, influence, and longevity, a continuous, unbroken line of inheritance. Sustenance. Raj's breath hitched. The sustenance was not blood, not flesh in the way he understood it, but something more insidious. It craved the slow decay of hope, the grinding erosion of spirit, the creeping despair that took root when ambition turned to obsession, when love curdled into resentment. It feasted on the generational trauma, the unspoken grievances, the quiet madness that had always seemed to plague his family line, the strange disappearances, the sudden bouts of melancholy, the inexplicable accidents. These were not random. They were the entity's meals. A low, grating sound echoed from somewhere deep within the stone, a sound like a vast, ancient mechanism shifting into place. Raj froze, his eyes darting around the confined space. The metallic tang in the air grew sharper, almost coppery. He forced his attention back to the folio, his heart hammering against his ribs. The final, most damning revelation lay in the last few pages, written in a different hand, a more modern script, but one he recognized as belonging to his grandfather. The pact was not a single event. It was a continuous chain. The prosperity came at a cost that escalated with each generation. The sustenance was no longer enough, and the vessel had to be of the bloodline, the one who inherited the estate, the one who sought to understand its secrets. Raj's vision blurred. The words on the page seemed to swim, coalescing into a single terrifying truth. He was the next link. His meticulous research, his determination to uncover the estate's secrets, had not been an act of defiance, but a fulfillment of the pact. He had been drawn here, not by chance, but by an ancient, malevolent hunger, orchestrated over centuries. The house hadn't merely swallowed a remote monastery. It had swallowed his ancestors. And now it was preparing to swallow him. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn wall beside him, feeling the damp grit of millennia. The air thickened, pressing in, carrying the scent of something akin to wet loam and rusted iron. But underneath that, a cloying sweetness, like overripe fruit left to rot in a closed space. It was the smell of decay, yes, but also of something alive, a burgeoning putrescence. The single lantern he carried flickered, its light suddenly frail, struggling against an unseen force that seemed to absorb its luminescence. Then, the walls themselves seemed to shift. Not a structural collapse, but a subtle, sickening undulation, as if the stone were soft, pliable. The rough-hewn surface rippled under his outstretched hand, like muscle contracting beneath skin. Raj snatched his hand back, a gasp catching in his throat. This wasn't old house settling. This was something monstrously organic. The passageway behind him, the one he'd painstakingly uncovered, now seemed to narrow, the ancient stones drawing closer, threatening to seal him within this suffocating space. It was not a language he recognized, but the cadence was unmistakable. A hungry, insidious murmur, full of ancient malice. It wasn't a solid form, not a creature of flesh and bone, but rather an absence of light, a deeper blackness that moved with an unnerving fluidity. It expanded, drawing in the surrounding gloom, coalescing into something vast and indistinct, yet undeniably present. It pulsed, a silent rhythmic expansion and contraction that mirrored the thrum in the stone and the frantic beat of Raj's own pulse. It wanted something from him, something primal and raw. This was no superstition, no trick of an old house. This was real. This was the entity. He turned, scrambling towards the narrowing passage, desperate to escape the suffocating presence. But the passage was no longer there. A solid wall of damp, unyielding stone had replaced the opening, seamless and ancient, as if it had never been disturbed. The hum behind him grew into a roar, a sound that vibrated through his very teeth. The air grew impossibly heavy, crushing. He gasped, struggling for breath, his lungs burning. He remembered the cryptic references in the journals, the desperate plea of his great-aunt to seek knowledge, to find a way to sever the connection. It was a place where perhaps the key to its containment lay, or where the initial pact had been forged. It was a door, or what once was a door, now veiled by the entity's power. He wouldn't let it trap him. He would find that remote monastery, no matter what this ancient horror threw at him. With a primal yell, he lunged, not knowing what lay beyond, only knowing he could not stay. The chill in the hidden chamber was a presence, not merely a temperature. It gnawed at Raj's bones, a deep mineralic cold that spoke of ancient stone and earth untouched by the sun. The script, a frantic scrawl belonging to a long-dead relative, detailed a desperate expedition to a remote monastery. The words blurred with Raj's own racing pulse, but the message was clear. There was a way to bind it, to quell its insatiable hunger, if only temporarily. The relative, a woman identified only as the matriarch, had chronicled her journey, her fervent belief that the entity could be starved, not destroyed. It fed on fear, on generational trauma, on the very fabric of despair woven through his bloodline. Starve it, the journal insisted, and it would recede, dormant until new fear stirred its ancient appetite. Raj's breath plumed in the frigid air. The concept was audacious, terrifying, and utterly mad. Yet it was the only thread of hope he had found in the labyrinth of his family's cursed history. But most crucially, it required a focal point, an anchor for the binding. The matriarch had used a relic, a small, intricately carved stone, which he had acquired from the monastery. He remembered a small, unassuming stone in a dusty display case in the main hall, an heirloom his grandfather had always dismissed as mere superstition. It was smooth, almost black, with faint, swirling patterns etched into its surface. Could it be the same one? This wasn't about fighting a monster with a blade. It was about outsmarting a primordial hunger. He pushed himself up, the stiffness in his knees protesting. It knew he was planning. It knew he was trying to break its hold. Raj ascended the narrow, winding steps, the journal tucked securely under his arm. Each step was a deliberate act of defiance. He emerged into the familiar gloom of the upper floors, the air thicker here, heavier with the scent of mildew and something else. Something metallic, like old blood, though he saw no source. He moved through the house with a newfound purpose, his mind a whirlwind of fear and grim determination. He needed the stone. He needed to find the exact location described in the journal, a specific point in the lowest reaches of the house, a place where the earth's energies were supposedly most potent. The display case stood against a wall, its glass dusty, reflecting the faint dying light from the tall, grimy windows. Raj's hand trembled as he reached for the small black stone. This was his anchor. This was his desperate gambit. His plan, cobbled together from fragmented entries and his own logical deductions, was simple in its terrifying audacity. He would place the stone at the center of the specified ritual markings he had painstakingly copied from the journal. No light, no sound, and the excruciating, active suppression of every flicker of fear. The house seemed to respond to his intent. A floorboard above him gave a sudden, violent crack, as if something heavy had dropped. A gust of frigid air swept through the hall, stirring the dust motes into a frantic dance. Raj swallowed hard, his throat dry. He moved towards the kitchen, the stone clutched tight in his fist. The kitchen was a mausoleum of forgotten domesticity, the smell of ancient spices mingling with decay. Raj took a deep breath, steeling himself. He was operating on a desperate faith, on the slender hope that a long-dead relative's madness held the key to his survival. He pulled the ring, the screech of rusty hinges echoing like a scream through the silent house. This was his only chance. He was ready. He traced a hand over the rough-hewn wall, feeling the damp grit cling to his fingertips. a testament to the house's true, terrifying age. The final journal, brittle and smelling of iron and decay, lay open on the makeshift table he'd dragged in. Its pages, filled with desperate, cramped script, detailed not just the family's descent into madness, but a desperate final resort, a location, a method, the remote monastery. The last of his ancestors had believed the entity, rooted in the estate, could be severed from its tether there, not destroyed, but starved into dormancy, its tendrils withdrawn from the bloodline. Raj felt a flicker of grim hope, quickly swallowed by a wave of nausea. He looked down at his trembling hands, the faint, shimmering veins beneath his skin, the tremor that had become a constant companion. He was already scarred, already infected, but he was still him. He had to believe that. The journey was a blur of aching muscles and a mind teetering on the edge of unraveling. The forest seemed to press in, branches like skeletal fingers, the air thick with unspoken things. He drove the old Jeep, its engine sputtering protests, deeper into the forgotten reaches of the valley, following the cryptic directions scrawled in the journal. His sleep, when it came, was a battlefield of fragmented images and the familiar, suffocating presence of the entity, trying to seep into his thoughts, twisting his resolve. He fought it, every waking moment, every desperate breath, clinging to the fragments of the plan. Finally, after days that felt like weeks, the trees thinned. A harsh, stony landscape opened up, revealing a plateau dominated by a structure that seemed to have grown from the very rock. It was a hulking, gray mass, utterly devoid of life, its high, windowless walls scarred by centuries of wind and rain. No cross, no symbol of any known faith adorned it. It was a place of stark, ancient purpose. The air here was thin, sharp, carrying the scent of ozone and damp earth. He stepped out, his legs stiff, his gaze fixed on the monastery. It felt like walking into the mouth of a leviathan. He remembered the journal's final entry. The blood that binds can also sever. But the cost? Oh, the cost. He pushed open the massive wooden doors, groaning on rusted hinges. The stone floor was worn smooth by countless footsteps, or perhaps by the passage of something else. It was angry. It knew why he was here. At the heart of the monastery was a circular chamber open to the sky, though the sky above was a bruised, churning gray. This was the crucible. Raj's stomach churned. He pulled out the small, ornate dagger he'd found hidden in the estate's library, its blade tarnished but still sharp. The ritual required a blood offering, a symbolic severing of the generational link. Not just any blood, but the blood of the current heir. His blood. It showed him fleeting glimpses of his ancestors, their faces twisted in ecstasy and torment, each one a link in a chain he was about to try and break. "You are part of us, Raj," it hissed, 1,000 voices in one. "Your heritage is our strength. Do not betray your true nature." A profound understanding, a horrifying reveal bloomed in his mind. The entity wasn't just in the house, it was in the bloodline. It didn't just feed on fear and trauma, it cultivated it, passing it down, ensuring its vessel would always be ready. His family hadn't been cursed. They had been hosts, living extensions of its will, generation after generation. And he was the latest, the most conscious, the most determined to resist. He was trying to amputate a part of himself. He gripped the dagger, his knuckles white. The air around him began to shimmer, distorting the ancient stone walls, making them ripple like reflections on water. It would be so easy. No. With a guttural cry, Raj slashed the dagger across his palm. A sharp, searing pain, and then a gush of warm blood, crimson against his pale skin. He squeezed his hand, letting the droplets fall into the basin. As the first drop hit the stone, a low, resonant hum filled the chamber, vibrating through the soles of his feet, up his legs, into his very bones. The air crackled. He felt a violent tearing sensation, not just in his hand, but deep within his chest, as if an invisible tether was being ripped from his heart. He gasped, falling to his knees, his vision blurring. The entity recoiled, its presence retracting, a terrible, agonizing withdrawal, like a parasitic twin being forcibly expelled. The hum faded. The screams died. He felt empty. He pushed himself up, his body trembling, his mind a wasteland. The entity was gone from him, he thought, or at least its direct tether was severed. He stared at his hand, at the wound. It was deep, still weeping. He felt no urge to bind it. He looked around the silent, stark chamber, then up at the bruised sky. The entity might be dormant, its direct hold broken, but the legacy, the years of fear, the trauma, the insidious influence, it had carved indelible pathways in his mind, in his very being. He was no longer a host, perhaps, but he was forever marked. And he wondered, with a sickening certainty, what new twisted thing might grow to fill it. He was free, yes, but the freedom tasted of ash and the lingering metallic tang of his own blood.